When I first spoke about 7.0, I promised I would do the same for 7.1 and the current Savage tier. So here's my look back at and review of the content added in service of deciding, was patch 7.1 so bad after all? As usual, there will be a heavy mechanical focus here. You won't be seeing the bosses, but due to the nature of the discussion, maybe still give this one a skip if you're trying to stay totally blind. Firstly, I was able to clear Light-heavyweight Savage, and I've slept on it enough times to form a coherent, finalised opinion of its fight. Black Cat is first up, and this one's a hit in my books. After 2 tiers of first turns being abnormally difficult, this tier has a true first turn. Thank you for reintroducing first turns into the game. The fight's overarching theme is testing your memory. Many of its mechanics revolve around remembering which mechanics will be done, as well as where and in what order. There are many moving parts with many different combinations, which means it's still fresh, even after having re-cleared it weekly since launch. This also tests tanks more than any variant Endwalker did. The difference between a good tank and bad one is very obvious, due to the need to position Black Cat in advance of where one of her 8 clones will be leaping to. The only bad part about this is it's the only real standout moment for tanks this entire tier. While you could argue Alarm 1 in M2 is also one, that's only hard on tanks if you're using a bad strat. A huge standout for everyone is Mouser, praised for how freeform it is. You can wing it with eyes or set up a fixed strat. You can get knocked forward, sideways, diagonally, or even stay within the same tile. All of this is without it feeling easy in any capacity. Overall, this fight is solid mechanically, but I do have to say that its greatly physical damage heavy output was an awful decision. It significantly weakens mitigations like Magic DPS Addle, as well as job actions like Magic Barrier or Dark Missionary. While I'm okay conceptually with certain jobs being better than others for certain mechanics, phases, or fights, when one brings shadow, the next must bring light. That is to say, when one job is outright favoured, the pendulum must later swing the other way, and it never has. This change serves only to further the several-year lead true melee DPS have on everyone else. Honeybee Lovely now. Truly the fight of all time. I'm gonna blast through the noteworthy things just to get the point. As expected, the Heart Bullet Hell phase is easier than in normal mode. Good, this was needed. I also find it to be quite funny that Alarm Pheromones was lifted 1-to-1 from normal to Savage, and it is the most formidable mechanic in the entire fight. And miserable. It's the lowest point of the tier, even after having optimized it as well as possible. Lastly, the main point. I can't believe I'm saying this after the hellscape that was on Arceus, but this fight doesn't have enough body checks. While it's a common trend for this tier that body checks are used significantly less than an Endwalker, this fight takes that to the extreme, and I don't like that. It's the worst part of doing this fight in PF. While I would generally agree that one person's mistake shouldn't be paid for by someone else, lean too far in the other direction, and you get clear parties with deaths for every mechanic, enraging on fights that don't even have DPS checks. Honeybee takes this to the next level, as not only do you not die on failure, you heal the boss! While this is a good way of handling early progression in statics, it makes PF nightmarish due to emboldening prog liars. Brute Bomber was a fight I wasn't too optimistic going into after its miserable normal mode, so you might be surprised to learn this was my favourite turn this tier. I'm proud to announce that a third turn isn't complete shit for once. This is overall a very honest fight. There are no baits, no gimmicks, just see mechanic, do mechanic, move on to next mechanic. It trials everyone's ability to read cast bars, visual telegraphs on the boss or arena, and visuals on their own characters too. It trials tanks' ability to space cooldowns, healer's ability to heal through incessant raid-wide damage, and melee's ability to fight for uptime. Especially that last point marks a drastic shift from Endwalker raids. In my opinion, M3S sits in the perfect spot in terms of uptime friction. Lowering friction would come at the cost of engagement, but increasing it would make the fight just straight up less fun. M3S sits perfectly on the thin line. Fight as a whole is a little on the easier side, but I can forgive it for that. Fuse Field was my favourite mechanic. 8 fuses appear on the ground of varying lengths, and putting them out deals massive damage to the whole party. The group gets some agency on when that damage comes out, but have to pace themselves carefully. Too slow will make it so you can't put them all out, but too fast will see you dying then and there. It's long enough that a mitigation use at the start won't last the whole way, so the whole party will need to work together and face them. I have a single scathing criticism of this fight though. Once you have it down, it's just far too slow. This gets old fast, while the other fight remains satisfying. It feels like for the first, 4 minutes, this fight has very heavy one cast per moving part syndrome akin to Endwalker. Wicked Thunder was the main miss of the tier. I thoroughly enjoyed Phase 1. The opening minutes were thrilling with fast, hard-hitting, multi-layered and satisfying mechanics. M4S Phase 1 was peak. Then we move to the transition. As Electrope takes over, we learn for the first time since E8 we have no door boss. There is no checkpoint, and we must do both fights in one go to actually clear. This is bad design for many reasons, but the primary one in my opinion is that M4S Phase 2 clearly compromised. The pacing, quality, and difficulty all took a sharp nosedive. Most of the mechanics felt like complete filler, as would be seen in an EX trial. I noticed this very quickly, and it soured the entire experience. And due to lack of a door boss, it soured Phase 1 too. I'd say Phase 1 would have been better as its own thing than the whole fight was as a whole. Then we reach Sunrise Sabbath, the first good mechanic in Phase 2. Wait, what's that? We don't reach Sunrise Sabbath? Because the DPS were pressing buttons ever, so we skipped it? Of course. I must also praise Sword Quiver as the perfect enrage push. That's after Sunrise, so it's even easier to skip? An easy comparison to make with M4S is to P7S, because that fight suffered the exact same issue to literally the opposite consequence. Those that were there for Abyssos might remember P7S as being very easy until the harsh difficulty spike that was Harvest. But sync that fight now and you won't be seeing Harvest. The majority of P7S is easy regardless, but without Harvest, it has a much more consistent incline in difficulty, which actually makes the fight healthier and benefits the overall experience. Skipping Harvest makes that fight good. M4S, on the other hand, still has that harsh decline in difficulty and quality regardless, but no Sunrise means it is for no reason and with no payoff, harming the overall experience. Skipping Sunrise makes that fight bad. My overall thoughts on the tier are that while M1S and M3S are easily A+ to S- fights, M2S and M4S are A+ to S- case studies on why never to do this again, for the love of fucking god. If I were to compare the fights, in terms of what I enjoyed, would probably be M3, then M1, then M2, then M4. In terms of what I think was objectively good, would be M1, then M3, then M4, then M2. But anyway, enough of the bad. Time for the Alliance raid. Before anything else about this raid, I noticed very early, thanks to parties that did wipe a few times, that these raid bosses aren't as scripted as others before them, due to the presence of HP percent pushes for, I believe, the first time since Dervan. If DPS is slow, they'll repeat mechanics, but if DPS is high, they'll skip the next part immediately. This potentially avoids a repeat of the Scales or Sunrise situations where bosses just don't do their interesting thing anymore. I hope this is enough to effectively future-proof the bosses, but we get 30 more item levels next patch, so really only time will tell. Now onto the bosses themselves. Firstly is Prish, whose charge-up gimmick I adored. A very neat callback to a boss from the first variant dungeon, the Gladiator of Sildir. If you've done that, you've done this, because she is just that fight again, but better. Not a lot else to say. Despite being the easiest boss of this raid, it was still much harder than any of the 12. Of course, since she's the first boss, she was never really going to do anything crazy, but the healing and body checks stood out to me. While they'll relax with gear, they were very tight on release. Then comes Fafnir. For this one, I simply have to set the theme. The fight kicks off with the dragon's tail glowing, which ends up being a 270-degree backwards cleave, leaving a 90-degree safe spot on his front. Then he opens his mouth, which begins to glow, leading you and everyone else to believe that this is a 270-degree frontal cleave. They just did back, now they do front, right? So everyone goes to the back of the dragon, outside of the hitbox, and then everyone dies. It's not a frontal, it's donut. That's the moment you'll remember forever and laugh about, and the moment nobody will understand unless they also did the Alliance raid day one. After that, the timing to actually leave that donut to dodge the subsequent ground slam is very satisfying to have mastered. There's also a very hectic wind phase, with a lot of AoEs at once overlapping, some of which outright one-hit KOs, causing significant uptime struggles. Also, the ads don't fold immediately, and they're actually a significant threat to the raid. Now for the Archangel, which is a 5-boss encounter. Need I say more? Yes, I do. The opening tether debuff had me worried that this was going to be a single target only fight, but I later came to agree with the choice. It guaranteed tutorial mechanics would play in their entirety. Each one does some pretty interesting things, but most notably there are actually things to interrupt. Finally! Once all of the mechanics are shown, all of the bosses do their mechanics at once, and you can group them for AoE. Considering how FF14 encounter design has been, this honestly felt like cheating the first few times. In a good way. This is easily my favourite boss of any Alliance raid. It will be my new gold standard going forward. Lastly, Shadow Lord, whose mechanics seem pretty standard for a piece of low-end content. Lots of cleaves to memorize in order, and some external things outside of the boss's body to track. However, at current gear levels he is lethal, with extremely unforgiving bleeds on any mistake, as well as frequent and abundant stacks. I've had a few near wipes, which have the potential to become very frustrating, but I found it enjoyable. Then, I joined an in-progress party that damn near ran out their instance timer on this guy, and I can't help but think I wouldn't be singing his praises if that was my first run. But overall, this is very easily the best, if not most difficult, Alliance raid we've ever received. And I'd like to thank the encounter designers for actually treating us like we've played 5 other expansions before this. This is easily higher quality than Evilise. Next piece of content from this patch that I did was Byakko Unreal. I didn't do this one on content, but even if I treated it as though it was a new EX, it was still an EX that I killed in a single lockout from Fresh, with some allies having not studied the strat. Which is extremely unusual in my experience, but makes sense, as it's an older fight from a time where mechanics were significantly simpler. There are like 2 mechanics in the whole fight that require a strat. I think this is fine, honestly. For a fight that's supposed to be easier than EX and is the intended starting point for high end, this is fine. But it's definitely a better social commentary than a fight, that's for sure. Sphene, on the other hand, I thoroughly enjoyed, but I expected an easier fight than what we got. Most of it was strong, the floor changes, gravity phase, and absolute authority especially. However, the ice phase is far too difficult for an 8 stream trial, in my opinion. Do mechanics with that tight of positioning requirements and that fast of timing on them belong in entry-level content? I don't know if they do. I don't hate the decision here though. Now that we have Unreal back, I'd say EX was the best place to experiment with this. While I anticipate some comments will say skill issue, and for the record I agree, it's not my skill that's the issue. EX is meant to be more PFable than this, and the fact remains that this is a game people prefer to be testing their game knowledge more so than physical execution, which is covered by job choice. Next, we have the Chaotic Alliance raid, which is not out yet, and that's precisely the issue. The patch is already over. I've done everything I want to from it, so I'm mentally checked out and bored out of my mind. I know I'm not alone in this. Yet a flagship piece of content is still a month away. Most people aren't going to do it, let's be real here. It's too little too late. While this will no doubt be a strong piece of content, it's arriving at a time after people have already been driven away by the lack of content. While I'm intimately familiar with the formula that's been in place since Heavensward, it could use work. A lot of work. It didn't work then, and it doesn't work now. On an unrelated note, even if this rise in dissatisfaction is from a loud minority of players, it's still genius to be collaborating with Final Fantasy XI at a time like this. Players leaving FF14 will no doubt be looking for a new MMO, and Final Fantasy XI is right there with open arms, ready to catch them. A lot of people are trying FF11. Not everyone will stick with it, but there will be a good chunk of the FF14 player base that's just stolen, permanently, by Final Fantasy XI. We don't know how many, could be 10 people, could be 10,000, but it will happen. I like to think I'm certain of which boat I'm in, which is playing both games at once. But just as easily as 14 won me back in Dawntrail, it could lose me again. If the content quality stagnates, or they kill another job I made, or they propose another expansion without a field operation, I'm not too sure if I can continue. I have a house in game, and at the end of the day, that dictates my spending habits. It would take a really astronomically big fuck up to get me to unsub, but if I ever were to, that's forever. Zero chance I ever come back. I'll definitely be sticking out the entire expansion, but after that, we'll see what we get. We'll see what they promise, and we'll see if they want me. Now, that is all for this video. If you have something on your mind that I haven't addressed, consider leaving a comment. My feed delivers them to me from all over my channel, regardless of how old the video is. Thank you so much for watching, remember to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you again soon.